Hey everyone, welcome to this week's release of the Hashrate Happy Hour podcast. On today's show, I'm joined by Michael Carter, the owner and founder of Bits Be Trippin. In today's episode, you might as well stop right now and just go grab a notebook because we walk through how to begin the discussions with a power company, how to negotiate a new power rate, and how to map out the work for building a mining facility. This is one of those episodes you really don't want to miss. Today's podcast is brought to you by our sponsor, the Texas Blockchain Council, a Bitcoin-first nonprofit industry organization working to make Texas the jurisdiction of choice for Bitcoin mining and blockchain innovation. They will be hosting North America's premier policy conference for Bitcoin and the digital asset ecosystem on November 15th through the 17th in Fort Worth, Texas. For more information, please visit their website at texasblockchaincouncil.org. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Like I said in the introduction, I'm here with Michael Carter at Bits Be Trippin. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hey man, thanks for having me. Glad to be on. It's I need to do more of these, so this is fantastic. Thanks for reaching out, and love to have a good conversation.
I'm really excited to have this conversation and this chat. You're somewhat of an OG. You have been, I think you were probably one of the pioneers of crypto Bitcoin mining on YouTube. And I mean, you have been dropping so much awesome content on people for 10 years now? How long have you been? Yeah.
It's been a minute. So yeah, I've been in the space for a long time. People often ask like, hey, when did you first find it? And I used to do what I usually preface it with is I used to do a lot of SETI at home and folding at home, which is a way to use your local computer to, send compute power for a particular, like folding is like doing protein folding. SETI at home was like search for extraterrestrial life. You would get like these packages of telescope data, and you would let the machine just chew on it, and essentially you were on a leaderboard of how much compute power you donated, essentially. And those both have communities, and during essentially after the initial launch of Bitcoin, it was still being CPU mined. There was a transition over to the first SG and CG miner releases. And when the moment you could mine Bitcoin with a graphics card is the moment I found Bitcoin. So I saw it on a post in a Reddit forum and just started researching, read the white paper, got into it very early. So we're talking like late 2010 is when the first GPU miner first came out. So it was right before 2011. And I started, kind of just fell into it, not understanding a lot of the, like what the principles and like the cypherpunk kind of movement behind it was, just more of like thinking of it from a technology stack, and then just started mining with one computer. And then eventually it took over all my folding at home computers, and just got into the space, was active on the forums on Bitcoin Talk. We're very early back in 2011, was making posts out there. People can go out there and see my profile. It's Alumar, ALUMAR, which was like one of my gamer names, the gamer tags forever. But just going out there, not really paying attention to the fact that like I was on there still when like Satoshi was on there. So it's kind of very weird, but not really having interactions with him at the time, but just really kind of trying to figure out how to get more compute power to participate on the network. And it wasn't even about like, I can get the point obviously from the currency standpoint and all that, but it was more of just like, okay, I'm on this thing. I'm trying to get on a leaderboard. Like, can I get more tokens? At that
time, it was
time,
kind of gamified back then.
It was game. Exactly. It was like, can I get more to do this? And it was just more around the tech stack, right? I'm the technologist, by trade. And it was just one of those things I wanted to participate in as much as I could. And it came pretty apparent to me that there wasn't pretty much, if you wanted any kind of understanding of like what your compute power would get you, there was these like wikis that were on essentially the web that you would find, and you would go in there and edit like what your config was for CG miner. And some of the O.G.s that are listening to this and know exactly what I'm talking about. It was like just a web wiki page that was out there. to put your Bitcoin SG or CG configs on there, for your 7970 when they came out. And before that was like the 6950 graphics cards. And
wow.
just like what we could do to compile to get things running back then. And like it got to a point to where it was like, you know what, there's no YouTube channels on this. Like there's nobody kind of like showing their config, showing their builds, like what we've done with like heating and all that kind of thing. So I created Bits Be Trippin in 2013. It finally, I was put on the forums throughout 2012, and I just like, you know what, there needs to be a YouTube channel on this. And I think the only other real like active crypto channel at the time was Mad Bitcoins and World Crypto Network. I think there was those kind of three. It was us three that were really the face of YouTube. I mean, there was a few. I mean,
did you ever hear of Rolf versus Luce?
The who?
Rolf versus Luce. And I'm drawing a
yeah.
So there was another OG.
Yeah, there was some like speaker folks that were really putting kind of the premise of how the cypherpunk movement of it and the importance of Bitcoin and the decentralization and the difference between like government and Bitcoin and, the governance models and how like nodes would work and all that. There was folks covering that. Andre Antonopoulos, like there was a lot of his content going to like Bitcoin meetups and stuff on YouTube. So they were like little myopic, events, but it wasn't like a normal like episodic channel kind of setup. Where we were trying to just like create kind of where does this thing go? And, there's some Bitcoin content out there. And then when Litecoin launched, we put some Litecoin content out there, Feathercoin, like all these different like iterations of layer one chains and like, can you mine them? So it was very tech centric to being a participant and trying to be, I don't know, kind of that active, like, here's what we're doing, observe, report stuff, right? Yeah. Like, not shilly or anything with the particular tokens, or it wasn't talking like, if you go back to all the old videos, it wasn't about the money. It was more of about like how you could participate and be part of it. And then maybe one day it would be worth something more. But I mean, we're talking like Bitcoin at like sub $100, right? So, it was, crazy times back then, but like, just really like for the tech heads, that really wanted to try to find some more content and kind of using it like, where you would do something on the internet, right? And somebody would tell you why you're doing it wrong, right? So sometimes you get this critical feedback in the comments and you're like, oh, you know what? That's a good point. And I'm always usually kind of upbeat. I'm like a half full kind of, mindset, right? So if somebody's giving me some critical feedback, I mean, there's trolls and anything on the internet, whatever, but like somebody's trying to like point something out and maybe that's just their way of expressing it. But like, sometimes it's good content, right? And they're just like, man, you know what? They're actually making a good point there. And then I would come back in. And if you look at a lot of those old comments and stuff I'd give, would be like, hey man, thanks. Yeah, that's a good point. Shouldn't, do it this way or whatever. And then almost every time somebody would respond back like, hey, thanks for taking my suggestion. Yeah, sorry I came off like an a-hole, but like, sometimes you can kill them with kindness, right? But like, I felt that was a good way to like approach YouTube and just create a community around it. And I mean, a ton of other YouTubers now have came around, and I would call it kind of taking the torch, of like the content, they've really grew to some large audience sizes and stuff, but it's just great. I'm like a pro community type of person. So
it's fantastic.
It's good.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And for my audience and everyone listening, you have to go check out the channel. You just dropped a whole bunch. I think it's a whole series on your new container build, and we're going to get into that. We're going to get there.
Yep.
But I actually want to back up. I'd actually love to hear what your background is. So you got into mining purely for the tech and the just how cool it was. What's your background?
Yeah, so I have a pretty diverse background. So I worked for Anheuser-Busch for years, and I know they've had some rough goings the last few years, or last year at least. But so old AB before InBev bought them. So I'd done all kinds of roles there. I was in this like management accelerator program. So I did all kinds of different roles. I was a pricing analyst. I was a margin analyst. Would work a lot of SaaS programming and financial models and predictive analytics stuff, big data stuff before like it was really big data, enterprise data warehousing, that kind of stuff. So development, mainly core with some pricing and analytics. So that's where I kind of get that fintech kind of background in general, is just how companies make money, how you price things, how you look at logistics, how you look at supply chain, that kind of thing in general, from like a 3-tier system. So some pretty diverse background from there, almost 10 and a half years. Then I switched over after InBev. I'd bought them. I stayed a few years and switched over to the Department of Defense. So I know that's going to rustle some feathers for folks, but I am supporting the warfighter in that when it comes to logistics, planning, understanding, architecture stuff. I switched over to like data center design, downrange, fiber optics, all the things that have to do with moving transport of data, enterprise data management, the large facility in plant, out of plant stuff, which really translates into the Bitcoin infrastructure that we'll get into talk about. But, just, from a solution architect standpoint. So, I'm Black Belt 6 Sigma, Green Belt 6 Sigma, which is just like process automation, how to take, something that's failing a lot and improve it, like fix it. A lot of the kind of solution design stuff. So and a lot of that comes out in a lot of the videos when I'm like explaining things of how we approach things and like methodically look at processes and see if we can lean them out. Which, I mean, the GPU world, if you were mining for like Ethereum and that back in the day, was like you needed to do it because it was a disaster to try to get a bigger like farm functionally running consistently. But like, a lot of that kind of stuff helping really on our builds and stuff. But, that's kind of the professional background. So really just those couple roles. I did a little stint with Southwestern Bell for a little bit too, but right out of school.
I have to ask, was the transition from Anheuser-Busch to data center build out for the government, was that an intentional transition, or did you get approached and it's like, that sounds like a cool idea?
It was a conversion from where the government and kind of where I live near U.S. Transcom, so Transportation Command, where they really were looking at commercial best practices at the end of the day. Like, at the end of the day, it's like for anybody. Like if you nurture a process and then it grows and it gets better, and then now it's one of those things that like, well, how are they doing it? Because we're doing it one way and it's not really working out for us, but they're able to, you can order something online and it shows up within the same day now. Right. So commercial, like supply chain went through the moon, right? Like the analytics, the ability to suggest the next thing, to cross correlate deals for you, all those things. That was the machine of supply chain, like the Amazons of the world. And, Anheuser-Busch as an example, being able to think of a product, to create said product and get it down to every mom and pop on the planet within like 3 months. Right. So from conception to inception to production to downrange to somebody, right. Being able to do that in like a 3-month span. And then you look at like traditional government processes that are, very heavily weighted on policy and politics and all that kind of stuff, mixed with like, you're still trying to get something downrange. Like, how can you use some of those best practices? So it was a natural kind of transition to try to optimize and save the taxpayer type of thing, as an opportunity to be part of that. And then a lot of it's the same thing. Business and transport and procurement, all is kind of a universal language, right? Okay. It doesn't matter who's doing it. It's still a lot of the same kind of processes. And then there's a little more added security, because obviously the government side, you have to do supply chain risk management, like SCRM and all these other kind of processes, just because of obvious reasons. But, it was interesting to see that kind of fold, but it was a lot of the same kind of thing. Like, how can I optimize this thing? How can I, make this faster, less, spend less money with it, have a higher sense of quality? The whole Six Sigma thing is, it's like, can you get more than 5 nines, right? Can you have this much uptime? We start thinking like Bitcoin, right? Like, how can I keep a machine running without having to service it all the time, right? Like, how can we get to this kind of optimization, self-healing, that kind of thing? So, I mean, it was that could be for beer to, government to Bitcoin, right? They're all the same kind of supply chain kind of issues. It's a very translative, process. So it wasn't a huge jump. Mainly just obviously the architecture of like government compared to like a business. The model's different, right? Like businesses are commercial capital trying to drive down costs organically or, not organically, bad decisions, fire a lot of people. And then you're like, oh crap, like Elon did with Twitter. And then they had to bring a whole bunch of engineers back. Right. So like having like different initiatives that drive to the bottom line versus like government's a little different. Don't really think about the dollars. Obviously part of the reason why Bitcoin looks good, like, cause you have inflation, all the other output of like what happens with government, but looking more of like capability delivery, what's the end product, kind of thing. So, it's really stratifying those different, structures and models, was a little different, but like, I mean, just as a technologist, it gives you a lot more opportunity, related to that. But like, it's, all of it accumulates a lot of experience that allows me to kind of help, build our initiatives out. Right.
Yeah. Well, you did a beautiful job tying that together. I have also a lot of experience in corporate America. I was coming from 3M, like 8+ years, almost a decade at 3M, same type of thing, big processes. How do you get stuff downstream as quickly and efficiently as possible? You just do a much more eloquent job of tying how that works to what we're doing now with Bitcoin and Bitcoin.
I mean, part of it's that solution, talk, but I mean, and you're really looking at the people too, man. People make it's people are the processes, helping the processes, and you got to be cognitive to what that impacts to a person, and looking at how to do it appropriately. There's certain things that I don't like about big business that I think honestly the government does better in certain things, and there's a lot that the businesses do better than the government. But like, like an attrition, I'll give you an example. The attrition for government, if done right, and I've seen multiple instances where it's like if they have a position slated to not be refilled, that person rotates already out of it, like because they have a schedule. And they just don't refill it. Right. So that's a good attrition model because you're not letting somebody go. You're just not refilling it. And you're kind of staging it up to where they rotate out because they already have a schedule where they rotate. And companies like AB did this too. They did it like that model because they took that at least the old AB did, where sometimes you'd have a person in a role, but you would try to move them a lot. Like my accelerator program piece was, I wasn't in any one position more than 2 years, so I was already kind of working. Can I improve something in this, and I already have an out date that I'm going to move on to the next thing, and that starts to mature in the last 6 months, and then if they're not going to refill it, they just don't refill it. So then you're not letting people go. It's just like, I think there's a lot to be learned on both sides. I try to always go in kind of, that half full kind of thing. Like, how can we better improve this and stuff? And I don't know, there's a lot of things like that we're learning right now in like the Bitcoin space too, of, just operations and management of building a bigger facility. And like, how can we, the machines, what's the rotation of the machines? What's, is there maintenance stuff that has to be done to facility, to AVHC, all that kind of stuff. Right. And Bitcoin's building its best practices right now. So it's cool to be in the kind of ground base of setting up what makes sense for it and stuff too. So I can see a lot of parallels with it. It's interesting.
It's super exciting. It's really exciting. I'm pretty new to the industry. And so for me, it's like, I get out of bed really excited about just how much, foundation we get to lay in all of this. So I want to kind of take you forward now. So thank you I appreciate the look into your past. I like to hear where people are coming from and what kind of led them into this crazy world of Bitcoin mining. But to bring you forward, we were talking about kind of the dog days of mining, and you're talking about how technical it was, and still on a fairly small-ish scale. Back then, were you guys even talking about power and the power mix that you guys had at a site or a facility, or was it just like you were so head down on the tech that it's like, who cares what the power rate is?
Yeah, no, I don't think we really started talking like the power mix or any of that until it started getting any kind of level of scale, right? Like essentially you're kind of I don't want to call it a victim of circumstance, but if you're trying to do it from home, or even if you have a business, what you have is what you got, right? Like you can't go and change too often just because of, the mix. You might be able to go with like two different providers because they'll sublease to each other. Like you might have a co-op that you can switch to. But like when you start talking energy mix, the only thing that you could really do is if you wanted to like add your own solar or something to that to, maybe offset some costs, or you could find some kind of an incentive where it just makes sense to buy solar, right? And then add that into your consumption side to where you not have to pull so much from the grid.
Sure.
But no, I mean, like, back in the day, no, it was more of like, what's my house 200 amp panel and what can it handle and what's safe? And why do I keep blowing 15 amp circuits? And, I can switch those to 20 amp circuits. Sweet. Like that was more the kind of, approach strategy. And I know like working with folks that had like apartments and trying to figure out like what, people running stuff like in their bathrooms and popping GFIs and stuff. But yeah, no, you're not really seeing much on, your mix or any of that kind of stuff. And even like at the time, like time of use or any of those kind of things weren't really discussed, right? When it made sense to like, why is the power bill so high? And is finding out that maybe it's only 4 hours during the day during peak, and like, as you started to get really thin margins and not so much yield, it started to make more sense of like, wait a minute, like back in the day I'd mine and maybe get 12 Bitcoin a week. Right. And it was like, Bitcoin, maybe, $40 or something at the time. And it was like, oh, this is some pretty good money, but like, is this make sense to like change our power? Because like the time, it was maybe 8 of the like jalapeno miners that were like 8 gigahash. Right. And like they weren't using a ton of power anyways. And like, you got to think of like the power cycle changed with Bitcoin to where it wasn't using much for a little bit there. Right. So we were going from like having 3 and 4 card GPU rigs to like a jalapeno that was using maybe 70 watts. Right. So it was 8 gigahash and that whole machine was maybe 3 gigahash. Right. And I was using 1600 watts on that. And I went to using 70 watts. So there was this weird period of time when like the Antminer Avalon A1 came out and like it wasn't using a ton of power FPGAs, they just, you weren't really thinking of it then. It wasn't until really like the S4s and some of the larger units, the Spondulis that was using 1600 watts and like the, 2U, server kind of style that you started like looking at it like, wait a minute here. Now I'm going to start using 1600 per each of these or 5 terahash at that point. And then it really started to make sense if you're trying to scale that up. Because those first few ASICs were terrible. They were there. I mean, the Titan from KNC, like half the cubes would work. I mean, there was a lot of like exit scams. Like there was hardware that showed up, but it just wasn't printed right. I mean, there was errors and issues. Really the Rock Miner, the S4, Bitmain stuff, the early stuff, the Antminers at that time, was really that kind of pivot to now you could start to think of bigger operations. And I think the very first like large operation I remember seeing is the Bitfury operation that was up in Washington, which was like a custom ASIC design setup where there was no shell to it, right? It was essentially just a breakout board with a power supply, and then the ASICs were just set in kind of open air, and you had a lot of air going across them. And that's when you started looking at kind of the grand scale, larger shelf systems and stuff.
High density, large scale, yeah.
Correct. And that's where now you're thinking, okay, I'm going to start using megawatts of power or at least in the US. There obviously was an expansion in, other countries. Most of the stuff set in China before May of 21. But like, those kind of setups really came after May of 21. I mean, at scale.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. And I guess that, when you think about it, it's just a power draw and that stuff that makes sense that, the power draw plus the incentive mechanism behind it too probably wasn't quite, like you said, it was like $12 per Bitcoin, or no, you were earning 12 Bitcoin and they were maybe
12
like,
Bitcoin at the time was about $40 a Bitcoin. So it was still pretty good. I mean, I was a home miner, could pull that kind of Bitcoin at the time. It was just, it wasn't a ton. I think at that time, I remember November of 2011, it was about that a rate of return for what you had from GPUs. And I think Bitcoin at that time was about $2, about $2.16. So, you earn about 24 a week equivalent at that point. And then Mt. Gox kind of came around, and then it went up to $11 around then, around those days. And then you had this rifle from like November, December of 11 to 2012. That was the kind of where everything changed, right? At least from those early days, which was when like MSNBC and everybody started talking about what is Bitcoin. It shot up to $212, right? So it was like $11 in December. It was $212. And then that really kind of started to change things of like, okay, what if you started kind of scaling this out a little bigger? And what's the cost benefit? What's the risk? Because when we start talking facilities, like actual facilities, you got a lot of infrastructure cost. You got buildings, you got property, you got rent, you got lease, you got potentially people helping you manage it. Those are real cost. Mm-hmm. And at the time, the hardware maturity level was really low still. And we could see that the ASICs were going, we're going to be what was coming, right? And that's what really drummed up, I think, the cost benefit of like building an ASIC and all the cost around that, where people really started looking at building them out then. And then that's where our channel really kind of pivoted, because we just couldn't get like it was possibly hard to get ASICs then. Like you'd prepay. I remember trying to buy 2 Titans and sending the Bitcoin for them, and not getting one of them, and then getting another one, getting one, and then it only like one cubed worked, and then trying to work through like RMAs, and then KNC just up and folded. So it was just like, okay, I think it was like 10.65 Bitcoin at the time to get one. And I remember doing that twice. So that was 20 Bitcoin to buy that. And then like, the olden days, I mean, the first time with, when Newegg started accepting Bitcoin, and I remember picking up and making a post. A lot of this stuff's on Twitter. Like people could go back and search our Twitter history from back to 2013 and like see these posts from us making them. But like, hey, Newegg's accepting Bitcoin now. I just bought 5 or 6 GPUs we're going to try. And they were like $600 GPUs. And I think Bitcoin at the time was $117, and it was just like, I was paying like 5.2 Bitcoin per GPU. Right. And it was just like, here's 24, Bitcoin, gone. Yeah. But, we were living the idea that, hey, this is a currency and you could use it for these things. And we're able to generate, the security, and for that we're getting Bitcoin, and for that we're buying more hardware. And I was just kind of, in hindsight, I don't think I would have even changed it then, because it was just like, that's what we were thinking. Like it wasn't that it would go to $20,000-$30,000, right? It was like, that was like, whatever, man, that's like 1,000 actually. Are you kidding me? But like, it just, again, it was back towards the hardware. It was back to trying to make sure people knew how to do it, and just building the network and growing the network and its value and all that. I mean, that was kind of the push.
Yeah. And fast forward to today, well, I'd say really the last like 3-4 years, you've really started to see kind of that industrial scale. It kind of moved and pushed past kind of that 10-20 megawatt site into, you got kind of the mega farms now in the hundreds of megawatts. So I kind of want to move in that direction with the conversation, is you guys are building out a pretty sweet facility, mobile containers at a substation. Why don't you kind of dig into this most recent project? It's all over your YouTube channel. So again, for the listeners, please go check out Bits Be Trippin. You guys do a phenomenal job documenting, I mean, everything from even testing the Starlink, satellites out to make sure you can get the right Wi-Fi reception that you. It's very cool. So maybe for those who haven't seen it, or just give us a little bit more on that project and what you guys are working on now.
Yeah. So locally, we worked with a local power company here, and that was its own little adventure to even try to, contact them and try to work out, is it possible to get a competitive rate in the US, and then like doing just analysis of what is a competitive rate compared to let's just say North America. So looking at, folks that we've talked to, DMG as an example, up in Canada, working through some of their rate structures that they were able to establish with like the hydropower, and just seeing, hey, we got a lot of wind power here in Illinois. When you drive up and down 55, you up to Chicago, you see a lot of them turned off. It's like, hey, do you guys want to turn those on? Like, how can we take advantage of some of the power costs and the hedging that happens with these groups, and really establishing a power rate with them that even the power company didn't even know it was possible, right? Like the rates at the time were about 9 cents per kilowatt for commercial 3-phase service. So that's like high yield. Like if you were a factory and you were trying to use a couple megawatt, you would end up paying 9 cents at the end of the day. And, really working the rate structure with them to what's in the realm of possible. Like who is the owners of all the power production, right? From like the windmills that are turned off. And can can that be part of this energy mix? And, what is possible if have a very high uptime? So a lot of people are like, well, how do you go and establish a rate that doesn't exist? And it's like, well, it's the load factor, right? That you have to tell them, like the fact that you don't have to shut down unless, you're doing a curtailment, and that you can have this constant load factor they can guarantee. That starts to change the equation on them for it, right? So like their folks that work through the hedging and cost will look at that kind of load factor and then be able to establish a better rate and get your energy rates down to like 3 cents. And then it comes back down to what's your distribution cost, your supply cost, right? Is there folks in the middle that are, I don't call it rent seeking, but just have some kind of other established kind of rate wherever you're set up. So really looking at the grid, looking at different substations that are there and working with them. And again, this is really like, you got to have a power company that's willing to sit down with you, like a business development person at the power company. And that's kind of what their roles are, right? So it's trying to find a power company that you can get to, and then get to the business development person, and then try to work out a new rate with them. That's a big critical piece. And then really set that foundation to see, can you get the rate to where it's competitive for your particular region, and then set that up accordingly, right? So we're able to get that established, got it as a public rate, so like people can contact our power company, find the same kind of deal. Like this was not like some kind of like deal with us. It's a public company. They have to give the same rate to everybody. We're like, I'm yelling from the top of the hills. And what we've done is we've been able to have a couple videos on the channel like this, and people have reached out to us and said, hey, we could call them, but like, let's work out something to where we want to just implement and maybe use you guys as like the deployment and stuff. And we've done that now for a couple people. So it's the same kind of thing that you can have done. I mean, we went down to Texas. We've talked to people to set this up before. Arizona, North Dakota. We've done it in a few different areas to help people kind of get this established, but like finding it to where you can then operate, and ideally finding it where you physically live or can operate, because travel and stuff, for family and all that. So, if you can get it to where you can do it locally, that's fantastic. And then just, establishing the rate. And then once we had that done, we're able to put 4 containers, 40 footers. You'll see it on the channel, almost 1,400 machines, ASICs. They're all Bitmain ASICs. Average around 100 terahash, so anywhere from 100, 104s, what we're using mainly out there. And the other distinct difference is going 277. So, which is a little different, because most people go 415, 240, or, 208, commercial service. where we're doing 3-phase 277 and using the stock Bitmain power supplies on a majority of the units that have the AM logic board. And then we have a range of machines that have the Alpha Miner 5600 watt PSUs with some just the Awesome Miner custom firmware. But like by and large, almost everything's using like the base stock firmware. And, we just flip between low power and, high power mode. There's a lot of other things that you can do with like customization that we're
especially
working
with
on.
Those alpha miners. Yeah.
Yeah. To do some maybe optimization. But, the one thing I've started to really learn, especially at scale, is why that's really good for a smaller farm, because you can manage it, down to the chip level and all that. That's great, but like try that with 1,400 machines, right? So it's like you can maybe dial in a few and spend a ton of time on it. It's just a time management thing. So the first thing I would look on that order of operation is what's the most stable, consistent uptime that I can get. Aim for that, and then kind of work your way the other way. And as you get more time, you can put more customization to like the firmware. But all you're doing is introducing what would be equivalent in like the IT world is multiple baselines. And if you're doing it at scale, you're going to have all these different baselines, and it's going to be like, oh, well, the ones on this rack are running this, and the ones on this rack. And then once you start pulling the miners for like service and maintenance and put a new one in its place, it starts to break all that too. So that whole configuration management. So if you're an IT person listening to this, and you think like, your CMDB, your configuration management database, and your IT asset database, and all the things that keep you in check on something that scale, like it starts to break down very quickly if you're trying to have all these different baselines. So, we're really working on internally on how to optimize that, from asset management to using a SaaS to maintain, a software as a service to maintain like our assets and, MAC addresses, that kind of stuff, just for easier management and stuff. But yeah, that's like that. We cover a lot of that on the channel, just like, the deployment. It's, 5 megawatts, and I'm working now on a couple other deployments, a little under 1 megawatt, and then one that's about 1.5 megawatts. So yeah, just continuously expanding as much as we can.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Support for this episode comes from Sunnyside Digital. Are you ready for the next Bitcoin bull run? Get ahead of the game by building out your Bitcoin mining infrastructure now. Sunnyside Digital is your one-stop shop for everything Bitcoin mining, from transformers and switchgear to racks and miners. With a white glove approach to understanding your needs, they'll provide you with the hardware you need at the most competitive pricing possible. Say goodbye to your sourcing headaches and say hello to Sunnyside Digital. Contact their sales team today at sunnysideinc.ca or via email at sales@sunnysideinc.ca. All right, now back to the show. Yeah, that's fantastic. So you established an entirely new rate with this power company. So first of all, the power company that you're working with, is it, I think you mentioned it, but just to bring it back, it's a co-op.
Yeah.
So they are, co-op meaning they are buying their power from a generation company in the state or somewhere, or
correct.
They're buying their power collectively. Interesting.
Yeah, correct. So that means that they had to have some good hedges in place, which they did. And then, but there's also opportunities because they know the power and they know the structures of the BPAs and the purchase agreements and now understanding the load factor, using us as essentially that guinea pig to understand more, they can go negotiate different rate structures and setups for purchasing and understand as we bring more, folks to the table here. And we've also talked to a couple other local co-ops that have gained interest, right? They're like, wait a minute here, you can get this constant load factor. They'll curtail, like we do. MISO is keeps track of, a large area in the Midwest, and they will issue us alerts to where if there's a high load demand, we can curtail our load, and get alerts and participate in that. That helps you also if you're a large power user, because you can get an opportunity for cost avoidance. So there's certain rates in your bill, if it's distribution or transmission costs that you have to pay per kilowatt, that you can actually fully avoid. So In our case, it could be as much as 50 grand a month. It could be even higher, depending on the rate schedule, because you have seasonal rates, that can adjust. And that's kind of what's hurt some other folks, where they had an adjustable rate, where they had a great energy rate. They had an understanding of what their taxes were going to be, but they weren't reading the fine print on the adjustable seasonal rates, especially if there's like price auctions and stuff. And, if something, war breaks out somewhere and there's a hit on natural gas, and then like you have a hit, and if your energy mix has 60% natural gas in it, well, lo and behold, you absorb this big hit that you weren't really anticipating. So being able to cost avoid that is critical. So setting your structures up to where you can, understand your bill at the end of the day. I mean, you think of all the costs that you have in the crypto space. Your energy cost is one of your biggest.
It'll be the biggest.
If you have an adjustable rate, that really hurts. It can sink you quick if you have that. And there's some facilities, publicly traded companies that have been hit like that, where it's just all was well until the rates adjusted, and then they're literally left with shutting down things. And they may have an agreement where they have to buy a certain amount of power. And it's just trying to get the least amount of change in those type of things is critical.
Absolutely. It was kind of put on full display publicly with a couple of companies, which was too bad to see. I'm in Minnesota. One of them was here. So it was really too bad to see that. So when you look at the timeline to establish a new rate, and I had a little bit of experience with that here in Minnesota and out in South Dakota. I didn't personally try and go get a new rate established, but I had some personal experience in just how long some of these projects can take. How long does it take to get a new rate established?
Yeah. So the rate part, we started in, what was that? October of 21 was really where the conversation started. And it took till about May of 22 really to kind of get it, done. And it was a few big meetings of just like, it was an initial meeting just to kind of kick it off. Like, hey, here's what we're trying to do. Here's what an ebb and flow looks like. Here's a pro forma of like how we generate, the capital to pay the power. Because at the end of the day, they're like, hey, how are you going to pay this power? We're talking about a lot of power. So they needed to understand like the yield structure of Bitcoin, and then how they can get, I don't want to say like 100% guarantee, they have this upfront cost, that they make you pay, because you're a new customer and you're talking about a lot of power. So they make you pay essentially a deposit, which is almost the cost of an entire bill. So in our case, 5 megawatts is around 150 grand, 126 to 150, depending on, the total usage that we were using. And like you have that upfront as another upfront cost. So you had to get that kind of established. So, and then on like the 13th month, it essentially pays for your 13th month. So you kind of get it back, but like that was part of the agreement, right? It's like, hey, for your deposit, you're going to pay up front. You're going to have to pay a full month, and then you're going to pay your first month, right? So you're like, oh my God, this is expensive. But then on the 13th month, you get it back. So it's like, and so they're looking for the sustainability of operations type of thing. So they were trying to understand that structure, kind of came forward very beginning with that, because, you're essentially weeding out anybody that's just not really committed, because they're essentially coming out and telling you right away, you're going to be have an extra 100 grand or so that you have to put towards this. So kind of getting through that first gateway. And then they had offered, me an opportunity to go talk to the board. So then they pulled together, most of the co-ops are done by a board. It's a board of the different participants and people in the community that are part of the co-op. And I got to go it was supposed to be an hour. I ended up spending almost 3 hours and explained what Bitcoin was, cited a lot of different things that would help support the understanding of establishing an operation here in their location, and just answered a lot of the questions they had. I pre-sent kind of a little annotated outline of what we were going to cover, which allowed them to kind of preform a lot of questions. I gave them some examples of questions they may want to ask. So everything, I call it kind of handed it onto a platter for them. Just like, here's all the things I think you're going to ask me about. Here's a punch list of that. So us taking the time to actually put that together for them helped kind of navigate the conversation, and gave them a comfortability that we had the maturity to operate in their area at the cost that we were talking about. So it was a key thing, I think, that starts the conversation. If you come out there and you show, hey, I'm willing to put the time and the money into making sure you're educated in this particular understanding of this business, understanding that you guys could say no, right? But taking the time to do that, I think established a level of, just kind of olive branch to them. They allowed me to have that conversation with them. They, published meeting notes from that because it's public, right? It's a co-op. And then it came down to, okay, let's identify areas. And then we took it a little step further because we were looking right out of the gate to put it on the substation, which is their property, right? So I wasn't trying to lease something next to it. I was like, literally, I want to put it on your substation. So what's that entail, right? So it was working through leasing agreements, understanding on how that would work. Most of the substations, at least in our area, they kind of overbuild them. So they have a lot of excess space and they put a lot of extra gravel just in case they were going to do expansions in particular areas. And they kind of overbuilt the transmission side. So like our substation that we're on could build another bay, right? As an example. And then even with the other bay, we still had the room to put 4 containers on it. So there's a couple more sites around here like that, but it all came back down to like, can I sublease it? And then what's that look like? So we had to establish a different fence structure, hooked to their ground grid. There was a lot of things that we had to align engineering wise with their engineering folks. So we had to get our engineering folks with their engineering folks and then kind of like, okay, how is this going to work from, a permanency and then not so permanency? Like if we had to move it, do I not damage things and stuff? So there's some of that from an engineering discussion that you have to have with regards to like, how are you going to set them and how are you going to connect to the ground grid and who needs to be certified that's going to be out at the site, right? Because we're talking about a live substation that's protected under like the NEC. You have to be like certified if you're on the substation side. So then what's the boundary or agreements from a safety standpoint? We had to go through safety training and all that, hard hats, high vis, all those kind of things. But just establishing it, because a lot of it didn't exist, at least for being a tenant on a substation, right? So there was some of that we had to get established, for that to occur and get them comfortable with it. And then, the agreement on like the transformers, what kind of transformers we need. And then our particular containers had different requirements. We have 800 amp panels. We were going to run 3-phase 480 straight to them. And then, do you do that with switchgear or without switchgear? Do you have disconnects? All those kind of things that come into your engineering and planning. We had to walk through that with them. So that's when people start thinking of the timing, when you start having all those different types of meetings, we essentially had a standing like Friday afternoon meeting with them every week,
every Friday.
Right. So it was just like what's occurred. And like, we're coming from what we were talking about earlier. I come from like very project management, large structured facilities. So I had a Gantt chart with all the different elements. And I like taking it, even if I don't own it, I put it on my Gantt, right? So I put it in there, all the things that somebody else is doing, for I'm tracking to how I'm running our general contracting work, right? So, and then we have all this other stuff with regards to like financial planning and all that. So all that's like one large master schedule. And like a basic shell of that is 126 lines, right? Just a basic shell. And then that can blow out to almost 800 lines when we're done, of just fidelity to get an operation like this running. Now, people can do it without any of that, right? But then you may be searching for like, oh crap, how did we get here? Or what was that agreement and all that kind of stuff. So I've tried to like structure it in such a way that it was meticulous enough to answer all the mail, because then you have all the other things you have to deal with when it comes to like the zoning and like, people around. We did a sound survey. We did, a noise pollution survey, essentially.
Wow.
Like, were we creating more environmental noise in this area? And like, it was all these little things that we were having to kind of check off and, try to find it fiscally responsible. Like the sound guy was probably like $2,500 or something, but it was a post, a pre and a post, analysis. So we showed, here's the proverbial noise pollution that we were creating, which wasn't actually that much based on the way we were set up. And we have like a tree line and stuff near us. There's not a lot of like housing structures near us. We're next to a highway. So you have like all these other luckily benefactors that, don't compound and kind of issues with that. But like, heat analysis, and like we're going to be blowing heat into like the substation, because 2 of the containers are pointed that way. So like there's a lot of that thermal stuff, and like just all these things that you wouldn't think that you would want to do or have to do that we just kind of did, because it was like the things that I would do for like an out of plant, in plant exercise for like a data center. Right. So I was taking the things that we would do that just principally, and how we affect the environment around us, how's water drainage work, and all that kind of stuff. So it's all these things that, we've helped other, large institutions do, right? It's like, like people are like, oh, Carter, you only got a, 86,000 subscriber channel. Like, how you kind of an OG, but like in the background, like we're going out to a lot of the larger facilities and stuff and helping them just because of that experience, right? The enterprise experience.
Well, and just again, from the 2 experiences I had, that was the missing ingredient. Just to be totally honest, the projects that I was working on, I had to pivot and went a completely different direction, but you could tell the missing ingredient was exactly what you just said. Where are all of these pieces, and where's all the planning? Where's your engineer? How is all of this going to play in? And, good learning experience for me, but I mean, the level of professionalism that you brought to that. So I have to ask, did they have the electrical infrastructure in place, ready to go, plug it in, you're good? Or did you guys bring, because what I hear a lot is, well, we'd love to have you as a customer, but there is pretty substantial system upgrades or even a whole new substation that has to get dropped in. Was that there for you already?
Yeah. So that's one of the huge advantages of setting up on a substation. And so a substation by and large is designed to distribute power, at a scale to a particular area. And with the high voltage that was coming in, and the larger mid, they would call it kind of a mid step down. It's like a 40 megawatt transformer. And then that goes into essentially a power rail system that then goes into separate large 3-phase service lines. We actually took one of the bays and one of the service lines. So that was all in place. It wasn't hooked up yet. It was all, the infrastructure was there, but then that came in to do the distribution to our 2 2500 kVA transformers, which they provided. So it's essentially kind of a baked in part of the rate, but like the rate is like competitive. And so it's essentially, I don't call it kind of like 2 free transformers, but essentially it's their hardware. And essentially for the metering costs and that, it's part of a base charge. I mean, I want to say it's sub $500 for that, right? So way cheaper to like get the service from that. Not every location's like that. Not even the same like situation with the same company and a couple different locations. We wouldn't have been able to do that because the transmission adjustment was a different setup. So we would have had to have like our switch gear and another step down for another setup that they had. So like we were able to hook up direct 3-phase 480 to those 2 2500 kVAs, which is like 2.5 megawatts each. And then essentially the lugs, we maxed out the lugs. So you have like a primary service that comes into a transformer, and then the secondary comes to you, right? So like whatever you're hooking it up, each of our containers had 3 800 amp panels in it. And they're set for the large fuses that are in those are set for copper only. So our cost and expense was a little higher because we had to run copper direct. You could get away with running aluminum and then using these NSIs to switch it, but it's not recommended. Like both of the engineers were like, I don't really like going from aluminum to copper. So we went straight from the lugs straight to that 800 amp panel. And it saved us tremendous amounts of cost, right? So the being on the sub and only really having to pay essentially from our transformer to our service. So the bearing of that, and then, a couple thousand feet of, 500 MCM copper, which people can do the math, is about $90,000 worth of copper.
It's big.
At the time, copper's coming down now, but like that's essentially what the majority cost was. And then, obviously the GC, company having to do the bearing of the line and then hook into the ground grid. And, we had to add a fence. There was a few other things in there, but like by and large, like way, way, way cheaper, to do that. Now, when you start thinking like containers, containers can range anywhere from like smaller ones could be 34,000 all the way up to 170,000, depending what container you're getting. And it really comes down to, all the service panels already in there, or all the racks already set up with all the networking switches and everything. That can get kind of expensive. And if you talk 4 containers, about 1,400 machines, you start looking at, that's like $600,000, $700,000 just in containers. You could build a building for that, and you could put some cheap racking in it and build a hot and cold lane. And that's your math, right? You start figuring out, is it cheaper for me to build a container or buy a container solution or build a building? The difference between the containers is the containers are like mobile data centers. And even more so, like from the zoning aspect, they're like a piece of network equipment. So meaning I didn't have to have from a zoning standpoint, like bathroom. It's not livable.
Yeah.
Right. It's just a device that's sitting on in a substation. So I didn't have to have the ADA compliance or any of that kind of stuff, because I'm not going to have, that kind of requirement in there. It's a network closet, right? So essentially, if you have a building, you're having to meet all those other requirements predicated on your particular, geographic location. You might have additional requirements, ramps and all those other things, because you're going to have people come to it, and you have to be considerate of like who's going to be going there. On this, we're going to have people that are going there also, but not the people that are going to be servicing them are, NEC folks, that are electricians, and like our guys here had to go through like OSHA 10 hour and those things. So we had to have certain other levels of compliance. We traded off some for the requirements of having, certifications to be on an active substation, but it made way more sense, to bring down that cost. So we were looking at, it was close to almost a 60% savings compared to like building a building next to it on top of buying the property and everything else. So it really leans that cost out. So if you can find an opportunity to put it on a substation, or right next to it, you save on that transmission cost. Also, when you're looking at your bill, you become a primary service consumer versus like a secondary, to where you're going through like secondary networks, and you have that extra cost element in. We are getting it directly, effectively from the source downrange to the tap, and we're right off the tap, right? So they actually had to back down the transformer some, because when they first hooked them up, our power panels lit up and it was showing we were at like 287, right, on the 277. So we were running hot because like we didn't have a lot of parasitic loss, right? Because we were effectively
so direct. Yeah.
So they had to back them down. They have a way to set their power factors down to allow us to get more to that 277. But a lot of things were learned there. Like my background in like building stuff like this, from all the total operations project management standpoint down to even some of the programming, feel very comfortable with that stuff. The power is, and understanding like power cost and where it's coming and phasing and all these other, potential issues you could run into is all discovery for me. So this is part of, the learning process for us, and, my team with Todd and Samantha and everybody else. Like we were really learning as we were going with relation to the power and how those things work, and, things that we should consider, and doing power surveys and, phasing surveys and that kind of stuff. Like when you start to really scale it up. But you don't have to know engineering all of it, but knowing the fact that you should have an engineer for it is kind of where that delta is.
Right. makes a big difference. Yeah. And again, like I said, I think it was your polish that you brought to the table, because these power companies, they'll work with you, especially for a high load factor customer. Yeah, they'll sit down with you and they'll figure this thing out. Especially the new business development teams, they'll sort this out with you, because they're incentivized to do so. What if you had to boil it down? So I know you had a lot of meetings. There was a lot of time spent establishing all of this, the rates, the facility inside the substation. What was the single biggest concern coming from this co-op?
I would, from the colo was their biggest concern.
No, sorry. From the co-op power company, like what, like of all the things that you guys had to work through, what was maybe the biggest thing where they're like, I don't know about that.
So part of it was the how we would handle like curtailments and the pivot of the load. So one of the things that as we started working with their engineering team that they didn't like, so if you think about like a normal any other power consumer, let's just say, typically you wouldn't have like whatever process is running be so directly tied to like the network, like the internet. Meaning if the internet's disconnected, I don't shut down all the power, right? And in the case for Bitcoin mining, the load, if you lose an internet connection, the load comes off, right? It drops to like we will swing from 5 megawatts down to 78,000 watts in a blink of an eye if we lose internet connection, right? So part of that is how can I ensure that I have the most consistent uptime from sending package, because the Bitcoin miners are receiving proof of work, they're working on it, and they're sending shares back to a pool. Even if you're proxying it, same kind of thing, right? You can you can set it up to where you're running your own proxy. You're doing if you have a large enough facility, you can just work on it. They call it kind of shadow mining, but like you could be working on the proof of work on the current nonce and then transmit your work if you win a block, right? And you could set it up that way. Not ideal, but like if you're, then you're not as susceptible because it's more of a LAN process versus a WAN process, right? But like, they were concerned. We were 5 megawatts. We were absolutely going to go to a pool, and they wanted to understand more, like how can we prevent you guys from like having a swing like that. And even on our curtailments, we stage our curtailments rack to rack. Like it takes, 15 minutes for us to come down. We just don't switch off. We pause mining in an array kind of format, right? To just slowly bring down the load to where we're not going to trip or cause extra stress on the transformers. So having a redundant internet and a path for that was first critical, right? So the architecture we set up to facilitate with that, from essentially the routing, the VLAN architecture that we run, the redundant internet connections where we have multiple internet connections, to make sure that they fell over. We did a test with one container to make sure that it did it appropriately, pull the network connection, make sure, plug it back in, make sure it was restored, pull the other one on, the LTE backup, make sure that, and then having two kind of separate entities, right? We have Starlink and we have LTE. There is no physical lines near us. Unfortunately, the fiber stops. So there is fiber in the area, but it's not near us. It would cost, a couple $100,000 to move it. There is a chance they will bring it down, a cable line down, and we'd probably end up adding a third connection at that point, because it's pretty cheap on business cables, $150 a month. But being able to bring in that, but having Starlink's consistency in the business side class. So you have different models of Starlink that you can order. We have a business class one. It's about $500 a month. So it's a little higher but that has a higher level of guarantee on, like we will be one of the last to shut off versus like a normal consumer grade one.
Sure.
So it's, you're paying for that extra higher chance of service. Now we've only had Starlink blink out on us in the 6 months. We've had it blink out on us twice. And that was during very heavy storms. And then, our LTE picked it up. So, we've had relatively no downtime from internet connection, which is great. The only downtimes we've had were actually caused because the sub went down, because downstream something happened with there was actually a tornado in pretty close to our area, took down lines and shut our whole substation off. So it swung almost 40 megawatts then, but, that's been our relative downtime. But that was their biggest concern was, are we going to damage the equipment? Cause we're just swinging 5 megawatts back and forth, on the network. And then just, this was kind of a first foray of them allowing effectively citizens in the area onto a substation, and how were we going to handle that, right? With having a separation fence, and then having us have, at least some levels of certification and, understanding of the power. We had to go through, NEC training to understand, what happens, like if there's a lying down and, not to change your feet, like just stand there, like we test when we go in, we have a whole standard operating procedure to test the fence before we touch it, like just to make sure it's not energized, that kind of stuff, since it is ground gridded. And if it got charged, you want to get hit there. So just in our own operations to make sure the safety and stuff is in place. But that was really from their side, some of the big hangups,
I really appreciate that. I think it's really helpful to hear that because I mean, what a intricate detail that they were worried about. But then when you dive into why they were worried about it, it's like, oh, but duh, they're worried about big power swings on their grid. Yeah, that's no brainer. Yeah. I really appreciate that. And Michael, I wish we had more time just to kind of watch the clock here. We've gone well over an hour already.
Yeah, no worries.
Just to kind of wind the conversation down, I'd love to have you maybe give us if you were to speak to a young entrepreneur looking to get into the Bitcoin mining space, what kind of advice would you give to him or her? I'd love to hear you kind of maybe touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always suggested people to kind of crawl, walk, run into this because there's big money that you can spend in it, and a lot of that big money isn't necessarily on the mining side; it's in the infrastructure. So like starting small and understanding the different, potential pitfalls for your particular area before you really get into committed, or go work with a facility. There's a ton of open jobs right now in this community. And even if it's like from a part-time nature or, you do something where you keep your normal, main job and you can work part-time, a lot of different facilities would happily accept part-time over full-time just because of the cost implications. And not all the time you need to do these things. And don't be afraid to kind of get your hands dirty with it. Like understand the different processes. I mean, I'm tossing machines just like everybody else back there. I'm cleaning machines out. We're doing normal maintenance, cleaning filters, being part of all the processes to understand what it takes to actually operate and run, this space and just be excited to be part of it. And I think getting with an existing team is a great start because it gives you some kind of insight and you're also helping them out for a time being, and maybe a time of need as they're expanding. Those teams kind of, get big and then they scale back once they're deployed. I mean, we were as high as like almost 9 people at one point and now we have 4. So it's like,
sure.
And some folks went to other careers. We try to make it as smooth as possible for folks, but like you do scale up and scale down depending on your deployment. And so there's different times that people can find an opportunity to work with somebody. But yeah, I mean, just consume as much as possible and never hurts to really kind of organize yourself. I know I talked about a lot of the Gants and all the other like, business process stuff, but at the end of the day, it's a matter of just having your eye on the ball, having a spreadsheet, keeping track of all these things. And as you learn new things, it's okay. Just jot them down and make sure you don't forget them for the next time type of thing. And we're all discovering stuff. I'm adding stuff to it all the time. Like, I'm like, you know what, we've had a lot of little things that we've learned and just processes that we're trying to change and improve on to ourselves. So it's always a continuous learning thing and just as much experience as you can get ahead of it, trying to jump into it full tilt yourself. I mean, get as much as you can.
I love that. I mean, the crawl, walk, run, I think is a huge point. Buy a miner, put it in your basement, learn what it is, learn how to connect to a pool, learn how to get into the interface of the miner. And I mean, it's such a steep learning curve. It really does kind of become overwhelming too. So yeah, I mean, I love that message. Thank you for that. I also, at the end of the show, I want to make sure I'm giving you a nice handoff so that people can get in touch with you, find your channel, tell people how they can get in touch with you.
Yeah, for sure. So bitsbetrippin.io is our website. We have all of our services and stuff and how to contact us. Samantha is awesome and is always helping us out. She's a business operations lead. and really kind of keeps the schedules in place for all of us here. And, so if you're trying to reach out to us for any kind of inquiry, I mean, we have all the way down to just a single hour with us sometimes saves people potentially tens of thousands of dollars. So you can book an hour with us out there. So I do recommend that if you're about to go spend a lot of money, don't YOLO into any of this. I know it's tempting, but like it is good to kind of understand, no questions off the table on those things. I really try to help people in that kind of hour to help them formalize their thoughts in a place that helps them move their project along. But, just consume as much as you can. We try to put a lot of content out there on YouTube. Also is a great spot. I'm a very active person on Twitter, post a lot of stuff on Twitter too. I know that's a dumpster fire sometimes, but it's all what you're watching. So just follow the people that are giving you positive stuff. So, and every once in a while it'll suggest you some junk, but like Twitter's pretty good for direct things like that too. So yeah, that's where you'll find us most of the time. We have Instagram and some of the other stuff, but by and large, it's those three sources between the website, YouTube, and Twitter.
Awesome. Michael, this conversation was fantastic. Probably look for one in the future, maybe live at Mining Disrupt if I run into you down there.
Absolutely.
This was fantastic. Thank you again for the time, and you take care.
Yeah. Awesome.